You see that? In the trees. Something's moving.
Mother of God! It has legs!
That's no animal. That hut's standing up.
They buried him with military honors, though few who attended the funeral could say what he had done in the war. Lieutenant Alexei Mirov had survived the front, outlived his comrades, and spent the rest of his life in silence. Not even his wife could tell you what haunted him. But in the final months, when his body began to fail and morphine loosened his tongue, he started to speak. Not of battles, not of Berlin, but of a hut that walked on chicken legs. The nurses dismissed it as delirium. His wife wept when he whispered of a woman with iron teeth who spoke in riddles and stirred ashes with a human femur. But there was one orderly, young, curious Belarusian by birth, who listened. This is the account he left behind, and you may choose whether to believe it or not. The past doesn't sleep. It lingers. In ash and iron, in whispers behind ruined walls, buried in silence, are stories left untold, echoes of those who vanished, voices lost to time. But the archive remembers. This is where history breathes again. This is archived stories, because some stories were never meant to be forgotten. The forest near Lake Narach had always been a place of uneasy silence. In the winter of 1951, it was where Lieutenant Alexei Mirov was sent with a 6-man reconnaissance team under orders vague enough to make anyone uneasy. Their mission, as described by a colonel who never removed his gloves, was to investigate anomalous disappearances reported by a kolkhoz settlement not listed on any official maps. They called it Operation Black Silence. The operation's name was never explained. No one asked why a Soviet platoon needed to investigate something that sounded more like a fairy tale than a military threat. But Mirov followed orders. He always had. He'd fought at Kursk, marched through Poland, and watched the Reich crumble brick by brick. Bureaucratic mysteries didn't scare him. But the forest did. They arrived by truck, then continued on foot once the path narrowed to frost-bitten dirt. Trees rose like blackened columns, skeletal birches mingling with thick pines that blocked out the pale winter sky. Snow fell in dry flakes that made no sound. The deeper they walked, the quieter the world became. On the first night, they camped by an old partisan bunker, a relic from the last war. Private Sorokin joked that the silence meant the forest was afraid of them. Sergeant Malakov didn't laugh. He watched the tree line and muttered a prayer in Ukrainian when he thought no one was listening. The second night, they heard the knocking. It came just before dawn, 3 loud, hollow thuds echoing through the trees. Not woodpecker sharp or echoing rifle fire. It was rhythmic, too heavy, too deliberate. "Tree fall," Mirov said, though he didn't believe it. No one replied. The fire crackled like it was trying to speak. By the third day, their compasses began to spin. Radio contact with the regional command post dropped without warning. The technician, Corporal Levin, blamed sunspots. Mirov blamed something else but didn't name it. Then they reached the village, or what remained of it. The houses were half swallowed by snow, their roofs caved in, doors wide open like yawning mouths. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, just frost on every surface and a strange pattern carved into the snow outside the largest hut. Spirals nested inside spirals, too exact to be accidental. In the center of the pattern they found a doll. It was made of straw, twisted tightly, with human hair tied in a bow around its neck. Private Sorokin picked it up. Malakhov slapped it out of his hand and hissed something about things best left untouched. Mirov ordered them both to stand down and pressed forward. They would search the woods north of the village at first light. But as the sun set behind the branches, Mirov saw something beyond the tree line. A faint glow, not fire, not moonlight. It flickered like a lantern, and it was moving. They followed the light at dawn. It had vanished sometime during the night, slipping back between the trees as silently as it had come. But the snow remembered. Tracks, deep, uneven impressions, led away from the abandoned village and curved northward into the forest. No animal had made those. They were too wide, too long, and, most disturbing of all, three-toed. Sergeant Malakhov bent to examine one, running a calloused hand over the compacted edge. "This wasn't here yesterday. Someone's trying to frighten us," said Corporal Levin, his voice brittle from the cold. "Locals, superstitious peasants." "There are no locals left," Malakhov muttered, "and this is no peasant's trick." Lieutenant Mirov gave the order anyway. They would follow the tracks for 2 kilometers and then turn back, report what they saw, and let command decide if this was madness or something more. The men obeyed. They always obeyed in daylight. The forest grew darker as they advanced. The snow thickened. Branches clawed low like skeletal fingers. The silence was no longer peaceful. It pressed against their ears like pressure at the bottom of a deep lake. They spoke less and less, the only sounds their crunching boots and the occasional click of a safety catch being double-checked. At 1100 hours they heard the first voice. It drifted between the trees, soft, feminine, and incomprehensible. Not Belarusian, not Russian, not any dialect Mirov recognized. The men froze, rifles raised, but the voice continued, calm and hypnotic, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. Mirov signaled a halt. "Levin, flank left. Sorokin, with me." But Levin didn't move. He stared forward, his mouth slightly open, eyes glassy. "Corporal." Still no reaction. Malakhov reached him first and slapped the younger man hard enough to leave a mark. Levin gasped, staggered back, and looked around as if waking from a dream. I saw her," he whispered. "Just for a moment. She was smiling." Mirov's jaw clenched. "Eyes up. Keep moving. No one separates from the group." They continued, now on edge, each man glancing over his shoulder more often than forward. The tracks in the snow led them into a narrowing corridor between 2 ancient firs, and then, without warning, they stopped. Dead end. No more tracks, no broken branches. Nothing but a wide circular clearing blanketed in untouched snow. And in the center of the clearing, one single footprint. It was human. Small, barefoot. The toes pressed so deeply into the snow that steam still rose from it. Mirov stepped forward, then hesitated. Behind him, Malakhov whispered, "We should turn back." The lieutenant looked at the print again and felt something shift in his gut, like a memory trying to surface, something he'd heard in childhood, a story, a warning, but it was gone before he could grasp it. "All right," he said, "back to the village." But as they turned around, they saw new tracks, leading toward them, dozens of them, coming from all directions, and not a single one had been there when they entered the clearing. They ran. Not in panic, not yet, but with military precision corrupted by something primal clawing at the edges of their minds. Back through the narrowing corridor of pines, rifles raised, breaths sharp in the freezing air. The clearing with the single footprint was behind them now, but the sense of being watched did not fade. It thickened. By the time they reached the tree line of a sparse birch grove, Sorokin had begun to mutter prayers. Malakhov said nothing, his face set in granite as he swept his rifle left and right. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and then a sound. Not wind, not branches, the creak. Like wood under pressure, like hinges turning. And then they saw it. A hut, raised several meters above the ground, supported not by stilts or stone, but by a pair of grotesque feathered legs, chicken legs, immense, sinewy, covered in scaly hide, bent backwards at the knee, with 3 talons each digging into the earth for balance. It should have been absurd, laughable, a hallucination brought on by frostbite or hunger, but it was real. The structure atop it was worse, more like a cage than a home. Crooked walls patched with scavenged planks, bones dangling from the eaves. The door was round, low and slightly ajar. Smoke coiled upward from a chimney bent like a crooked finger. A dull orange glow pulsed inside, flickering as though the hut were breathing. The legs shifted, one claw lifted and stamped back into the snow. The earth trembled faintly. No one spoke. Then the door creaked wider, and from the darkness within a figure emerged. She did not walk so much as drift. Clad in tattered shawls, her back hunched with age or weight. Her hair was a tangled curtain of grey, streaked with moss and what looked like spider silk. Her skin, pallid and stretched, bore the colour of birch bark. And her face was something carved, not born. Her mouth was impossibly wide, and her teeth, they shone like polished iron. She said nothing, just looked at them. Mirov tried to raise his rifle, his arms did not move. Malakhov stepped forward, his voice flat. "Who are you?" She blinked slowly, then tilted her head. The voice that came was dry, like leaves rustling in a coffin. "You ask questions, soldier, but what will you give for answers?" The soldiers froze. None of them had spoken their rank. She had not asked. She knew. "I said identify yourself," Malakhov barked again, stepping closer. The crone grinned. Her jaw opened wider than it should have, clicking at the hinges. From inside her shawl, she pulled something small and pale. A human finger, still wearing a red army ring. It hit the snow with a muffled thud. Malakhov stepped back. The crone turned her gaze to Mirov. Her eyes, pale yellow like boiled fat, locked with his. "I know what you've lost," she whispered. "I can give it back." He didn't speak. "Come into the hut, Lieutenant," she rasped. "Or turn your back like the rest." And as her words faded into the wind, the legs of the hut shifted again. The door opened wider. Mirov did not remember stepping forward. One moment he stood among his men, and the next he was at the base of the hut, its shadow swallowing him whole. The air smelled of ash, moss, and something older, sweet and rotting at once, like earth long disturbed. The crone had already vanished inside. The hut's chicken legs creaked as it lowered slightly, just enough for him to grasp the doorframe. The wood was warm, pulsing, alive. He pulled himself up and entered. Inside, the air was impossibly thick, not with smoke, but with memory. The walls were draped with curtains made from stitched-together uniforms, Soviet, German, even tattered Tsarist tunics. bones lined the shelves, organized by size, some labeled in ink that bled and moved. A fire burned in a pit at the center of the floor, but no heat came from it. The flames licked upward in slow motion, bending sideways like they were listening. She stood by a crooked table, stirring a black iron pot with the femur of something distinctly human. "You dream of him," she said without turning. Mirov flinched. "Dream of who?" "The boy in the photograph," she said, lifting a faded piece of paper from the table. It was a photo from his footlocker. His nephew, Leonid, gone during the siege of Leningrad, presumed dead with the rest of his apartment block. Mirov had not seen that photo in years, and yet here it was, the edges curled just as he remembered. The crone turned. You could see him again. He swallowed. "What are you?" She smiled, revealing a mouth of blackened iron. "I am the price for what should not be touched, the test for those who ask too many questions. I am the old tooth in the jaw of the world." She motioned to the table where 3 objects now sat: a knife, a small brass mirror, and a doll made of straw and hair. 3 tasks, she said, as it has always been. 1 for memory, 1 for truth, 1 for blood. "I didn't agree to anything," Mirov said, voice hoarse. "You entered," she said gently, "and that is enough." She picked up the mirror and held it out. "Look." He did, and the mirror did not show his reflection. It showed Leningrad, a shattered street, flames licking at the sky, a small boy running, clutching a loaf of bread. Behind him, a wall crumbled. Soldiers screamed. It was Leonid. And Mirov was there too, rifle raised, shouting something. He watched himself hesitate, then turn away as debris crashed down. The mirror cracked in his hands. "You remembered wrong," she whispered. He dropped the glass, trembling. Next came the doll. She placed it in his arms. "Speak the name." He couldn't. His mouth would not open. The name was gone. "You've let the dead rot in silence," she said. "They remember." She moved closer, breath cold and smelling of river mud. "There is still 1 task left." She held up the knife. Mirov did not ask what it was for. Instead he stepped back, and the hut screamed. Not the crone, the hut itself. A howl of wood and fire and bone. The floor pitched sideways. The flames flared. The walls shifted, revealing rows of skulls hidden in the beams. Outside, his men called his name, and he ran. Mirov stumbled from the hut like a man half-born, falling into snow that hissed where his skin touched it. The air was colder now, unnaturally so, like something had been ripped open and left bleeding across the forest. His men stood where he had left them, but something was wrong. Levin had collapsed to his knees, whispering a string of numbers over and over, eyes rolled back. Sorokin clutched his rifle, pointing it at every tree, spinning in frantic circles. Only Malakov remained still, his eyes fixed on the hut, expression unreadable. The hut had changed. It now loomed taller, its legs rooted into the frozen ground, claws raking deep gouges in the earth. The firelight from within flickered faster now, like a heartbeat on the verge of arrest. And though the door remained open, the crone was gone. "Move," Mirov barked. "Back to the village, now." He grabbed Levin by the collar and yanked him up. The young man screamed, not from pain, but from some internal fracture that could no longer be sealed. They ran, branches clawed at their faces, snow sprayed with every step. But the forest had shifted. Paths no longer led where they had. Familiar trees were missing. Even the light looked wrong, too red, too low, like dusk had fallen far too soon. Behind them, they heard it, the footsteps. Not boots, not wolves, talons, massive and deliberate, shaking the trees with each impact. The hut was moving again. It was following them. At one point, Sorokin turned to fire into the dark. The muzzle flash lit up a pale shape between the trunks, something tall and skeletal bent at impossible angles. The rifle jammed on the next shot. He didn't speak after that, just dropped to his knees and began to pray. "Leave him," Malakhov snapped. "He's gone." Mirov hesitated, but Malakhov was already dragging Levin by the arm. Behind them, the sound of cracking branches grew louder, something enormous pushing through the forest without care, without pause. They reached the ruined village just as the last light failed. The pattern in the snow was back. Spirals, symbols, and at the center something new. A dollar, not the one from the hut. This one was shaped like Mirov. It wore a tiny officer's cap, and its chest was pierced with a sliver of mirror. Malakhov didn't speak. He stomped it under his boot and dragged Levin into the bunker. Mirov followed, slamming the heavy door shut. The hut did not appear. Not then. The night passed in silence so deep it hurt their ears. By morning, Sorokin was dead. No wounds, no frostbite. Just gone, eyes open, face serene, as if he'd finally heard something that made sense. Levin wouldn't move, just rocked slowly in a corner, clutching his own dog tags. Only Malakhov and Mirov were left with minds intact. They didn't speak of what they saw. They just radioed for extraction and waited. It took 2 days. By the time the trucks came, the spirals in the snow had been buried under new drifts, but Mirov noticed one detail before they left. There were no tire tracks around the bunker, none at all. They never spoke of it again, not in the truck that took them back to command, not during the debriefings, not in the long empty months that followed. Lieutenant Alexei Mirov and Sergeant Malakhov were transferred, given quiet posts far from the borderlands. Levin was committed to a sanitarium. His file labeled it as combat-related psychosis. No mention of huts, no mention of witches. Sorokin's body was never recovered. When Mirov returned to his garrison near Minsk, he found a citation waiting for him, a commendation for steadfast service in adverse conditions. He burned it in his stove the same evening. The forest stayed with him. It crept into his dreams, not always as a place, but as a feeling. That crushing silence, the frozen clearing, the chicken legs creaking just beyond the trees, and always, always, the whisper of a voice that knew things no living creature should. Years passed. The Soviet Union marched onward. Wars, revolutions, rockets. The world forgot its old ghosts, but Mirov didn't. He retired early, moved to a small dacha outside Mogilev. No one visited, no one called. He left the army behind like a skin shed in the dirt. Only Malakhov ever wrote to him, and even those letters dwindled into silence after the sergeant's sudden death. Stroke, they said. But Mirov knew better. He could feel the forest watching again. It began subtly, scratches on his window too high for branches, footprints in the snow that stopped at his door, then reversed themselves. A doll once, straw and twine left beneath his porch, its face sewn shut with red thread. He never touched it. Instead, he began to leave offerings, bread and salt, small tokens, just enough. On winter nights, he lit a single candle and whispered words he didn't fully understand. Old words. Words his grandmother had once muttered over a broken fence when the chickens refused to lay. And the forest stayed quiet until the knocking returned. 3 sharp raps at the door. Not the wind, not a visitor. It never came when the sun was up. It never happened more than once per winter. But it always came. 3 knocks, and he never opened it. Now, in the final days of his life, the weight of what happened in that grove has settled in his bones. He doesn't blame the forest, not anymore. It was never cruelty that drove what lived there. It was balance. He entered uninvited. He asked questions meant for firelight and fairy tales, not rifles and maps. And he was given an answer, one that took more than he realized. As he lies dying in his bed, breath shallow and slow, he thinks not of war or comrades, but of the mirror, the cracked reflection, the choice he made to turn away. And outside, the snow begins to fall. A shape waits just beyond the tree line, not moving, not threatening, just waiting, as it always has,